In this lecture, I'm going to talk about the Great Depression and New Deal and cover the United States through the 1930s up until the end of the Depression. We talk about the boom, the great bull market of the 1920s. Sometimes we call this the Roaring Twenties. It was a time of a lot of people speculating in the stock market, buying stocks, selling, trading, and this was exacerbated because of credit. People were what they called margin buying, buying on margin. And this meant that, say that a stock cost $100. Well, you only had to put down $9 or $10, and you were expected, with the great amount of profits you earned, to pay back that other 90%. And that was margin buying, and a lot of people took advantage of that. But the prosperity of the stock market hid several problems in the nation's economy. First of all, tariffs limited trade, and this was a worldwide issue following World War I. For the United States, the Smoot-Hawley tariff, trade decreased, and this was important to the economy, but these tariffs and the tariff systems in the United States and around the world severely limited international trade. Also many things, but buying power was somewhat limited. We were still on the gold standard, and that meant that money was very limited. Not everybody had access to money. And so a lot of the products that American companies were manufacturing, people weren't able to buy it. And because of the trade restrictions, they weren't able to sell their goods and products overseas either. Companies were making things, but few people could afford to buy all of it. Also, one big indicator is that farmers had not been doing very well in the 1920s. In fact, following World War I, American farmers had a lot of problems. Prices had gone down, and so many farmers were running short on cash and income. Some of the factors contributing around the world, remember, the stock market crash of the United States was just the indicator in the U.S. that there was an economic problem. There had been a depression going on around the world starting in the 1920s, and by the end of the decade, it finally hit the United States. And it hadn't been all at once, but it had been a gradual increase in problems. When the stock market crashed in the United States, prices on American goods went down. And what that meant was that we flooded Europe with some of these goods, trying to sell them cheaply. This contributed to the trade imbalances that I mentioned earlier. Many countries had adopted these protectionist tariffs, which meant that American goods couldn't come in except but at very low prices, and then they would be marked up. Gold was restricted. The gold standard hurt trade. Great Britain and France did go back on the gold standard, but the United States did as well, and we maintained that gold standard following World War I. And also it was a banking and credit failure. In places in Europe, because of the reparations levied on Germany following the war, they weren't able to continue paying that debt back to the Allies, and it hurt the United States in the long run. This graphic helps illustrate that. What was going on was that Germany, after World War I, was forced to pay reparations to the Allies, Great Britain and France. And a lot of that was being subsidized by American investors and Wall Street bankers, and they were helping Germany out. Well, when Germany stopped paying Great Britain and France weren't able to pay their war debts, many of those to the United States. Remember, during World War I, because of our protectionist system, we had not been involved with England or France, but we made loans to them. And so they had to pay this war debt back. And this was going into the U.S. Treasury, and when the reparations stopped that circle of payments, and so the United States was affected by it in the long run. In 1929, the great bull market came to an end with the bust. So you saw that boom of the Roaring Twenties, and in fact, May through September of 1929, stock prices continued to go up. This is an actual graph in the background showing you the spike in prices. Trading had gone up to over 381. For the Dow Jones, that was pretty high in those days. It's much higher today. But in the 1930s, you can see the 1920s, how the stock continued to go up. The Dow Jones Industrial Average continued to go up. But on October 24th, prices suddenly dropped. And people were selling left and right, trading at 12 million shares, which was phenomenal. It was like more than they had ever seen before. So some bankers, J.P. Morgan, and Chase Bank, and others got together to try to, what today we would call a stimulus package. They put together their own money in those days to try to bolster the stocks. And it worked for a day or two, but then the stock market dropped again. And on October 29th, Black Tuesday it's sometimes called, the stock markets began a precipitous slide, and the stock markets remained depressed for 4 years. But they never recovered until 1954 to the amount of trade that they had had in 1929. For the United States, the effects of the Great Depression included, of course, the stock market crash. The stock market crash did not cause the Depression. It was a symptom of the Depression. And another result of the Depression was the banking system collapsed. And it collapsed around the world. It also collapsed in the United States. There was widespread farm foreclosure. I mentioned earlier that farmers were already not doing well in the 20s, and this just pushed them over the edge. There was a lot of production that was cut back because companies could not afford to stay open. They couldn't afford to keep employing people. Nobody was able to buy things. And so production halted, the money supply dwindled, and unemployment was rampant. We talk about unemployment today. We get a little edgy when unemployment hits around 10 or 12%. During the Great Depression, nationwide, the unemployment rate was at 25%. That meant 1 in 4 workers were out of a job. It was a tremendously bad economic time in the United States. Unfortunately, President Herbert Hoover is often criticized with his response during the crisis. One of the things that he said most famously is, "Nobody's really starving," and that simply wasn't true. Although Hoover had participated in World War I, helping to stimulate the economy and helping to disperse goods and products and services around the nation, during the Great Depression, he did not seem to really rise to the occasion in the minds of many. He was committed to this idea of laissez-faire. Let the business handle its own problems. The economy was the business's responsibility. He did implement some changes, the RFC, Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was aimed at providing loans to big businesses to help them not fail during the economic crisis. He also established the Federal Farm Board to try to help farmers out. But overall, many people felt that Hoover just didn't care. And so, one example, a lot of things became associated with Hoover that were associated with the Depression, like people being homeless and living on the streets in towns and communities known as Hoovervilles. In 1932, before the elections, Franklin Delano Roosevelt ran as the Democratic candidate, and he won the nomination in the summer of that year. The New Deal, Roosevelt's program, traced its origins to several factors that we've seen throughout American history. One of those was the populist era. In the 1890s, farmers and workers formed the Populist Party, and one of the things the populists pushed for was regulation by the government of business. And so there was already this precedent. Also, the mobilization in World War I, where the federal government had really gotten involved in the economy and tried to make sure that the military had what it needed, telling people what to produce, telling businesses what to produce, and kind of keeping prices down. So many of those World War I appointees who had been in those bureaucracies continued to work for the government. There was also the idea of progressivism of the late 1800s and early 1900s, this idea of the government acting in the best interest of its citizens, not just helping business, but helping people. And finally, there was an economic theory. John Maynard Keynes, a British economist, what Keynes said was that when the economy is good, any government should contract its spending, should reduce its spending, should hold back, and save up its reserves, so that in times of economic crisis, Keynes argued, governments should spend more. They should prime the pump. They should infuse money into the economy and therefore keep the economy stimulated. What you need in any economic crisis is not people to hold on to their money, but people to let go of their money so that money flows in the economy. It's like circulating blood. You need that blood to circulate. Likewise, you need finance, you need money to circulate to stimulate the economy. When Roosevelt won the election in the fall of 1932, he really did not have a clear-cut plan. This idea of the New Deal was that the government needed to try something. In fact, as he famously said, if you try something, if it works, keep doing it. If not, try something else. So this New Deal that he didn't really have fleshed out kind of came to fruition in trying to do things that worked in stimulating the economy and alleviating the effects of the Great Depression. You also see a party shift among Democrats and Republicans. So whereas traditional North and South Democrats may have differed on things, the New Deal kind of unified those two wings of the Democratic Party. It also brought in urban voters, and some of these were labor, some of these were immigrants. It brought in progressives from the western states. It brought in African Americans who had traditionally voted Republican. And it had brought in business leaders, but this proved to be its weakest link because business was often at odds with the federal government and Roosevelt's New Deal. Roosevelt's New Deal can be divided into three types of programs. There was a tremendous number of programs implemented to try to stimulate the economy, and these were in two ways. One, in relief efforts. So these, sometimes called the alphabet soup programs because they're known by their abbreviations. The Federal Emergency Relief Act. This put in money to help people right away and to help businesses right away. The Civilian Conservation Corps, this was run by the Army, sometimes known as the Tree Army. They went out and did environmental projects. They built roads through national parks. They built rest areas along highways. They built roads. They did a lot of infrastructure building. The Works Progress Administration, the WPA, was also another one of these relief efforts that put unemployed people to work building buildings, federal buildings, state, city, local buildings. They also built roads and did other types of infrastructure work as well. In fact, in Houston, if you go down, our city hall is a WPA project. The other area was the recovery wing of the New Deal programs. One of those was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Remember, this is what Herbert Hoover had done to try to put money in at the top and hope that it would trickle down. But there was also the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, formed the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, which was aimed at getting money to farmers and farm businesses, farm workers, to help re-stimulate the agrarian, the agricultural part of the economy. And then there was the National Industrial Relief Act, the NIRA, which was aimed at helping businesses again, and especially in industry. As far as reform, they wanted to make sure that the same problems didn't occur again. Panics, depressions were not unusual, but they wanted to lessen the severity of these economic crashes when they happened. So one of these was the Banking Relief Act, the Banking Act of 1933. This was an act to restrict the number of bank closures, to also help banks deal with people when they rushed on the bank to get their money out and not leaving any behind. There was also the Fair Labor Standards Act. This was aimed at providing workers with a minimum wage, providing workers with an 8-hour day, providing workers with a lot of the benefits that we take for granted today. There was also the Federal Communications Corporation. This was a regulatory agency aimed at protecting the government's and therefore the citizens' access to radio. And this lasted for many, many years. This was aimed at regulating radio stations so that radio stations didn't dominate the airwaves. There's only a certain number of frequencies that radios could operate on. And so this was to protect them, to make sure no one got a monopoly. In addition to the New Deal, there were also other people calling for reform and offering different ideas on reform. One of the most famous and popular was Louisiana Senator Huey Long's Share the Wealth program. What Huey Long had, and actually he campaigned on this slogan, Share the Wealth, was that more people needed the opportunity to be able to have access to money. More people needed to have access to buying a home. And he just felt that there was too much inequality in the world, and this contributed to the Depression. And so we needed to eliminate that wage income gap and to share the wealth. Another was, you see his picture here at the bottom left, Dr. Francis Townsend. He was a medical doctor, and he was elderly, but he believed that there were too many elderly people who were still having to work, and this took jobs away from younger people. So he proposed a pension plan that would pay older workers to retire and allow them to earn a pension that they would pay in while they were working, and then after they quit working, they would be able to retire on this. Now, today, we call this Social Security because Social Security was built around Townsend's plan. And finally, there was Father Charles Coughlin. Coughlin was a Detroit Catholic priest, and he had a radio program from his shrine, the Shrine of the Little Flower in Detroit, and he would broadcast his ideas and comforting messages to people around the United States on one of these clear channel stations. But Coughlin became very critical of the New Deal. He also became very anti-Semitic and fell in line with a lot of other people who were blaming Jewish people for the problems, and fell in line with the conspiracy theorists. And so he actually, his archdiocese urged him to take time off and kept him from being on the radio and from being in the pulpit any longer. One of the interesting things about the New Deal is this is the first time that the federal government actively assisted minority groups in the United States. And one of the big pushes was for women, was for African Americans and Mexican Americans, Hispanics, during the New Deal program, Native Americans as well. Much of this came from the president's wife. Eleanor Roosevelt was a very big supporter of minority and women's rights. And one example is this woman in the portrait, Marian Anderson. Marian Anderson was a well-known, well-respected opera singer. And she was invited to she was going to give a free concert. However, the Daughters of the American Revolution would not allow her to sing at their hall because she was African American, and it was a segregated time period. So Eleanor Roosevelt moved to have Marian Anderson perform on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And so this is a very famous incident in 1930s American history, was that Marian Anderson actually got to sing for more people on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. There was also a black cabinet that was formed. This was a code name for Franklin Roosevelt's African-American advisors. And one of these was Mary McLeod Bethune of Florida, who ran a college, Cookman-Spelman College down in Florida. But there were other African-Americans, very prominent, who the president would call in and get their advice on how to address the needs of the African American community. Roosevelt also appointed many women to positions in Washington, D.C., and one of those in the cabinet even was Frances Perkins, who was Secretary of Labor, as an example. For Hispanics and Native Americans, there was also tremendous effort, but there was also problems. Many Hispanics, Mexican Americans especially, participated in strikes because of low wages or unemployment. There was also an attempt to move Mexicans out of the United States, and this included Mexican Americans. 500,000 people were sent to Mexico, some of them from Mexico, Mexican nationals were living in the United States. Some of them were Mexican Americans who had never been to Mexico or were second or third generation Americans, but they were encouraged and rounded up and sent back to Mexico. Encouraged to go to Mexico in many cases. The idea was that it's easier in an economic crisis in a time of poverty to live in a poorer nation. That didn't really make sense, and it didn't really work out that way, and it was very dispiriting and hard on a lot of people, but that was the argument. For Native Americans, they also participated in the New Deal, like African Americans and Mexican Americans, many of them in segregated units. But Native Americans, one of the big benefits that they saw was the end to the Dawes Severalty Act. The Dawes Act was an attempt by the government in the late 1800s to take land away from Native Americans and said, well, you can get a certain number of acres for yourself, but whatever is left over will go to the government can sell. What the Indian Reorganization Act, first of all, it recognized Indian tribes. And so this is where you get a lot of the tribal organization that we have today in the bureaucracy. The organization around tribes comes out of the Indian Reorganization Act of 1930s. But it also restored tribal lands. So a lot of those lands that Native Americans had lost on their reservation were then returned back to them. There were some minorities excluded. So if we look at the Social Security Act, for example, there were two groups of people who were exempted from Social Security, who were excluded from Social Security. These were domestic workers. Now, we have to think, who did this really affect? In the South, and in order to get the Southern senators and congressmen to support the Social Security Act, they demanded that domestic workers be excluded from Social Security benefits. This meant a lot of minority women who worked in domestic service industries. Well, in the domestic service, who cooked and cleaned house and whatnot. So, and in that economic sector, those women, minorities predominantly, were excluded. The other group that was excluded were agricultural workers. And again, predominantly minorities were doing a lot of these jobs in places like California and in the American South. So in these two instances, without actually saying this, the law worked to exclude some minorities from the benefits of the New Deal. On the other hand, the New Deal also assisted minorities, and again, as I said before, it was the first time anybody really paid attention to a lot of minorities from the federal government's level. In 1939, the New Deal started to come to an end. Actually, there were two New Deals. In 1936, a court packing plan. Roosevelt, because he was having problems getting some of his legislation through Congress, through the Senate, and some of the New Deal programs were declared unconstitutional. Roosevelt in 1936 had a plan that he would put on additional members of the court who would be sympathetic to him. Now, constitutionally, it doesn't say how many people are on the Supreme Court. It doesn't say how many justices there are supposed to be. It just says there will be a Supreme Court. But Roosevelt's plan, while not unconstitutional, was certainly distasteful to many. It felt that he was stacking the court, trying to get his own way, and making sure that his acts and his legislation was approved. And that kind of backfired on Roosevelt. Because of this, there was a second New Deal. But by 1937, we saw a recession occur again in the United States, and this soured some people to the progress that the New Deal was making. So by 1938, you do see more conservatives elected to the House, and this is going to make it even harder for more New Deal initiatives to be implemented. And there was also growing news from Europe at this time of the rise in fascist leadership in Italy, in Germany, which would draw our attention and eventually draw us into World War II. And so if we look at the legacy of the New Deal, what did the New Deal do? What did it not do? And in some summation, we've got to remember this. The New Deal did not end the Depression. What it did, it alleviated some of the effects of the Depression, but it does lead to a more regulated economy. And many are concerned because this marks in their minds the rise of the welfare state. This idea that Americans moved from this kind of attitude of what we call rugged individualism. People had to take care of themselves and their families, and people became more dependent upon government for assistance, and this idea of a social welfare system and the idea of a safety net. And it's also a move from a small, limited government to a big federal bureaucracy in many people's eyes, and they don't like it. So this is kind of where you see some of the ideas that the Democrats are more associated with big government and bailing out people, whereas you see a more limited government on the side of the Republicans. That's not to say that the parties are the same. The parties shift from time to time over the decades. But this is where you see some of the origins of this argument and this concern and this conflict over the size, the role, and the meaning of government. And also we're going to see the Democratic Party benefit from the New Deal because it's now being associated with the party of the working class people. So you see a tremendous change in politics and a change in government and a change in the economy as a result of the New Deal. Next lecture, we're going to talk about what actually ended the Great Depression, and that is World War II. And so we'll talk about that next time.